What happens when the law protects the wrong man? When truth is buried under signatures and silence? In the harsh lands of the Wild West, one woman dares to challenge not just a man, but an entire system built against her. Stay with me, because this story will make you question what justice really means.
The cold in Wyoming doesn't just chill the bone. It asks a question. It asks if you have the grit to get out of bed, put your boots on, and fight the earth for another day. Abby Winchester always had the grit. It was 4:30 in the morning, pitch black outside. The wind was howling down off the jagged ridges of Oak Creek, rattling the window panes of the farmhouse. Abby struck a sulfur match. The sudden flare lit up a face that had seen 42 hard winters. There were lines around her eyes, a hard, determined set to her jaw. It was not a face that asked for pity. It was a face that demanded a reckoning. She pulled her knitted wool shawl tight around her shoulders. She poured a cup of yesterday's coffee from the cast-iron stove. She drank it cold, black, bitter. Then she sat down at the heavy oak table in the center of the kitchen. She pulled a thick leather-bound book toward her. The field ledger. It wasn't a diary. You wouldn't find a single tear or complaint on those pages. There were no feelings in it, just dirt, blood, sweat, and numbers. She dipped her steel pen into the inkwell. March 15th, 1878, soil thawing early. Need to check the north irrigation trench before the melt floods the lower pasture. The roan heifer is breathing better after the willow bark tincture. She had kept this ledger for 14 years. 14 years of blistering droughts. 14 years of blinding blizzards. When the Texas fever swept through the valley in '71, wiping away half the herds in the county, Abby didn't sit down and cry. She didn't wait for a man to save her. She read. She quarantined her cattle, burned the infected brush, dug lime trenches with her own hands, and saved 90% of her stock. She built this farm, her hands, her mind, her will, but you wouldn't know it to look at the county records. No. If you looked at the official paper down at the Oak Creek Land Office, Abby Winchester didn't exist as a builder. She was just a grieving widow, a fragile thing, a woman who needed guidance. And that guidance came in the form of Silas Thorne. Silas, the town banker, a man whose soft, manicured hands had never blistered a single day in his life. The law in Wyoming Territory said a woman couldn't hold a property deed outright without a husband's signature. So, when her husband took sick and died 6 years ago, the county stepped in. The county appointed Silas Thorne as the financial overseer for her 2 minor children. He took 15% off the top, every single harvest, every cattle drive, every time she sold a sack of grain. 15% for doing absolutely nothing but wearing a tailored suit and signing his name on a piece of paper. But the theft wasn't the worst part. Worse than the theft was the whisper. "Poor Mrs. Winchester," Silas would say down at the saloon, shaking his head with fake sympathy, making sure the judges and the deputies heard him. "Grief has unhinged her. She's unstable. It's a mercy I'm here to manage the estate, or those poor fatherless children would starve in the snow." Unstable, crazy, hysterical. It was the oldest trick in the book. Call a woman crazy and suddenly no one listens to her when she points out the thief in the room. Abby looked at her calloused hands in the dim lamplight. Hands that had pulled calves from dying heifers in the freezing mud. Hands that had dug irrigation trenches until her fingernails bled. Unstable. Beside the ledger sat another stack of paper. Her shadow file. Every receipt, every crop yield, every transaction she had made for the last 6 years. And at the bottom of every page, a signature. Not Silas's. The signature belonged to old Mary Blackwood, the Cherokee woman who lived on the edge of town. The only soul in Oak Creek who saw Abby for exactly what she was. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Abby didn't flinch. She knew the footstep. Caleb, 16 years old, tall, broad-shouldered like his father, but with her eyes, those sharp, assessing dark eyes. He stood in the doorway. A wool blanket was wrapped around his shoulders against the morning chill. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the thick stack of papers sitting beside it. "You're at it again," Caleb said. His voice was husky with sleep. "The farm doesn't sleep, Caleb. Neither does the paperwork." He walked over. He pulled out a wooden chair and sat down heavily. The boy was frustrated, angry at the world. He'd been into town yesterday. He'd seen the way the men looked at his mother. He'd heard the whispers. "Why do you even bother, Ma?" Caleb asked. He pointed a finger at the ledger. "You write it all down, every drop of sweat, every dime, but they don't care. Mr. Thorne just laughs about it down at the bank. The men down at the land office won't even look at it. You're writing a book nobody with a badge is ever going to read." Abby put her pen down. She didn't sigh. She didn't look away. She met her son's angry gaze, holding it steady until the boy stopped fidgeting and held his breath. "Sit up straight, Caleb," she said softly. He did, automatically. "Now listen to me, and hear me good." Abby's voice was low, rhythmic, like the steady beat of a drum. "You think this is just about money. You think this is just about beating Silas Thorne. It's not." Caleb frowned. "Then what is it?" Abby leaned forward. The lamplight caught the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes. "It is about the truth of human labor," Abby said. Her words struck the quiet air of the kitchen like a hammer on an anvil. "Caleb, you must remember this. A civilized society cannot be allowed to erase the sweat of the women who plowed its earth." Caleb listened. The anger in his chest went quiet. "Physical labor creates natural ownership," Abby continued, speaking clearly, making sure every syllable landed. "That is a right granted by God, and by the dirt itself. It doesn't matter what any patriarchal law dictates in a courthouse. A society that builds its wealth on the backs of its women, only to deny them the right to their own harvest, is not a civilization. It is a theft." Caleb looked down at the table. "But the law is the law, Ma. The sheriff, the judge, they only look at the paper Silas holds." "Then we change the paper," Abby said flatly. "Or we force them to look at a new one. Silas Thorne is not a guardian. He is a thief operating under the cover of a prejudiced law. He uses that law to strip us of our dignity." She tapped the ledger with her ink-stained finger. Tap, tap, tap. "The law might be blind to a woman's rights today. Men like Silas might use the system to steal my 15%. They might call me crazy to keep me quiet, to make sure no one listens to me." She stopped tapping. Her hand flattened out over the leather cover. "But the truth? The truth never shifts. I am writing this down so that tomorrow this system is forced to learn what human dignity means. They will learn that a woman's sweat spends the exact same as a man's. And they will learn it, Caleb, because I will not let them forget it." Caleb stared at her. He was 16, still a boy in many ways. But in that moment, sitting in the freezing kitchen before the sun came up, he grew up just a little bit more. He understood. This wasn't just bookkeeping. This was a war. And his mother was the general. "They say a new land judge is riding into town," Caleb said quietly. "A man named Sterling. I heard the deputies talking. They say he's strict, goes entirely by the book." "Silas Thorne's book, no doubt," Abby noted. "Silas already sent a file up to Cheyenne about you," Caleb warned. "He told the judge you're unfit. He's setting the trap before the man even steps off his horse." Abby picked up her pen. She dipped it back into the inkwell. "Let him set his traps," she said. "A trap only works if the prey doesn't know it's there." She looked back down at her ledger. "You go on and get dressed, Caleb. The south fence needs mending before the calves get out. And saddle the roan for me." Caleb stood up. "Where are you going?" Abby didn't look up as she began to write again. "I'm going into town. If this new judge is coming to Oak Creek with a map drawn by a liar, I figure it's time he met the woman who actually owns the land he's standing on." Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Sarah was waking up. The quiet of the morning was over. The war of the day was about to begin. Abby Winchester turned the page. the heavy parchment rough against her fingers. She wrote her name at the top, bold, clear, unapologetic. The sun finally broke over the Wyoming ridge, spilling cold, hard light across the floor. It was a good day for a fight. Dust is a funny thing in Wyoming. It gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your throat. But mostly, it gets into the truth. It covers it up. Wyatt Sterling rode into Oak Creek just past noon. He rode a tall buckskin gelding. The horse was a veteran, just like the man on its back. Wyatt wore a faded blue cavalry coat, no insignia, just the ghost of where his captain's bars used to be. A silver star was pinned to his leather vest. Land judge. It wasn't a glorious job. It was a lot of paper, a lot of angry farmers, a lot of men trying to steal from one another under the guise of the law. Wyatt was a man who believed in order. He believed in the cavalry. He believed in the rules. He didn't know the rules here were written by thieves. His saddlebag was heavy. Inside it sat the Winchester file, 3 inches of neatly typed pages, handed to him that very morning in Cheyenne by a fast-talking clerk, and updated 2 hours ago by the Oak Creek town banker Silas Thorne. Silas had bought Wyatt a whiskey. He had smiled, a soft, easy smile. "It's a tragic case, Judge Sterling," Silas had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The widow Winchester, poor Abby. Grief has twisted her mind. She's unstable, prone to fits of rage. If I didn't step in to oversee the farm's finances, those 2 children would be eating dirt. You'll see for yourself. Just tread lightly." Wyatt took Silas at his word. Why wouldn't he? Silas was a banker, a man of standing, a man whose signature was on all the right lines. Wyatt trusted paper. Paper didn't lie, or so he thought. He rode past the town limits. The road turned to hard-packed dirt. He was looking for a ruined farm, a place run by a hysterical, broken woman. He expected sagging fences, starving cattle, weeds choking the wheat. He nudged the buckskin over a low ridge. He stopped. The Winchester farm sprawled out in the valley below. It wasn't ruined. It was a fortress. The fences were straight, pulled tight. Not a single post leaning. The irrigation trenches cut clean, sharp lines through the soil. The cattle in the south pasture were fat, healthy, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Wyatt frowned. He pulled the leather file from his bag. He checked the coordinates. Section 4, Range 9. This was the place. It didn't make sense. A madwoman didn't build straight fences. He spurred the horse forward. The hooves crunched loud on the gravel drive. A woman was standing by the barn. She was hoisting a heavy wooden wagon wheel onto an axle, by herself. She wore a faded cotton dress, the hem coated in mud. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows. Her arms were lean, corded with muscle. She heard the horse. She didn't drop the wheel. She slid it perfectly onto the greased axle, threaded the iron nut, and gave it a hard spin. Only then did she turn around. Abby Winchester wiped her brow with the back of a dirty hand. Her dark eyes locked onto Wyatt. There was no fear in them, no madness, just a cold, hard assessment. Wyatt tipped his hat. "Mrs. Winchester?" "Depends on who's asking," Abby said. Her voice was steady, grounded. "Judge Wyatt Sterling, Territorial Land Office." He dismounted. He tied the buckskin to the hitching post. He pulled the thick file from his bag and tucked it under his arm. Abby didn't offer her hand. She just looked at the file. She knew exactly what was in it. "You're a long way from Cheyenne, Judge," she said. "I go where the disputes are, ma'am. And right now, your farm is the biggest dispute in Oak Creek." Wyatt walked closer. He opened the file. He looked down at the neatly typed pages. He fell back into his training. The protocol. "According to the county records, this property was deeded to your late husband. Upon his passing, with no male heir of age, the court appointed Mr. Silas Thorne as financial overseer. Mr. Thorne has filed a motion. He claims you are unfit to maintain the premises. He is asking the territory to grant him full custodial rights to the property until your son turns 21. Abby stood perfectly still. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. "And what does the paper say about who built that barn, Judge?" Wyatt blinked. He looked up from the file. "Excuse me?" "The paper," Abby said, taking a slow step toward him. "Does it say who dug the trenches you rode past? Does it say who quarantined the herd in '71? Does it say whose hands are bleeding right now from fixing this wagon?" Wyatt looked at her hands. They were scraped, blistered. "The law doesn't concern itself with manual labor, Mrs. Winchester," Wyatt said, keeping his voice even. "The law concerns itself with legal ownership, deeds, titles, signatures." Abby laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, it was sharp, like breaking glass. "Legal ownership," she repeated. "A signature from a man sitting in a leather chair 10 miles from here." "Those are the rules of the territory, ma'am. I didn't write them, I just enforced them." Abby closed the distance between them. She wasn't a tall woman, but at that moment she seemed to cast a shadow that swallowed him whole. Wyatt felt his boots root to the spot. He had faced down charging cavalry lines, but the fire in this woman's eyes was something else entirely. "Then you need to listen to me, Judge Sterling," Abby said. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't shake, but it commanded the air around them. "I am listening," Wyatt said. "No, you are reading. There is a difference." She pointed a dirt-stained finger at the file in his hands. "You look at me, Judge. You look at me and you hear this." Wyatt looked at her. He couldn't look away. "Human dignity and a person's worth are not dictated by whose name is stamped on a piece of paper," Abby said. Her words were slow, deliberate. Every syllable struck him like a stone. "A person's value is in what they create and nurture. You are using the laws of the powerful to judge the survival of the marginalized, and that makes you just as blind as the paper you're holding." Wyatt didn't speak. He couldn't. "Silas Thorne is a thief," Abby continued, her voice ringing out in the quiet yard. "He uses a prejudiced system to steal what I have built. He calls me crazy because an angry woman is a threat, but a crazy woman is a joke. If you came here to enforce his theft, then get back on your horse. But if you came here to find the truth, then you better put that file away and open your eyes." She didn't wait for his answer. She turned her back on him. She picked up a heavy iron wrench and went back to work on the wagon. Wyatt stood in the dirt. He looked down at the file, the neat typed pages, the official seals, unstable, hysterical, unfit. He looked back up at the woman. She was turning the iron wrench with steady, rhythmic power. Wyatt Sterling slowly closed the file. For the first time in his life, he wondered if the paper was lying to him. The work never stops. That is the absolute truth of a Wyoming farm. The earth does not care if you are tired. The livestock do not care if your heart is breaking. They demand blood, and you give it. Tuesday morning was brutal. A section of the west irrigation ditch collapsed before dawn. Mud slid into the channel, blocking the water flow to the lower cornfield. Abby was out there by 5 o'clock. She stood thigh-deep in freezing, muddy water. She used a heavy steel shovel to dig out the collapse. Every scoop weighed 30 pounds. Her shoulders screamed. Her lower back burned. Caleb tried to help. She sent him to the south pasture instead. The boy was strong, but he lacked the patience for mud work. By noon, she had cleared the channel. The water ran free. She dragged herself out of the ditch. Her boots squelched. She was caked in black mud. Just as she reached the porch, a wagon rolled up. It was young Miller from the neighboring property. He looked panicked. "Mrs. Winchester," he called out, pulling his mules to a halt. "It's my milk cow. She's down. Swelled up tight as a drum. I don't know what to do. My wife is crying. We can't lose that cow." Abby didn't sigh. She didn't say she was tired. "Get a trocar," Abby said, walking straight to her barn to grab her medical kit. "If you don't have one, get a sharp knife and a hollow reed. It's bloat, Miller. You let her eat wet clover." I don't know how to pierce her," the young man stammered. "Drive your wagon," Abby said, climbing up beside him. "I'll do it." She saved the cow. She pierced the rumen, let the gas escape, and stayed with the animal for 2 hours until it stood up. Miller thanked her profusely. He offered her a dozen eggs. She took them, nodded, and walked the 3 miles back to her own farm. Nobody wrote that down. There was no official county record for saving a neighbor's livelihood. There was no territorial deed for standing in freezing mud to keep a corn crop alive. It was invisible labor. By 4 o'clock, Mary Blackwood was sitting at Abby's kitchen table. Mary was 67. Her skin was like old tanned leather, deeply lined and rich in color. She wore a simple woolen dress and a turquoise necklace. She didn't talk much, but she saw everything. Abby poured 2 cups of hot mint tea. Her hands were shaking slightly from muscle fatigue. She sat down with a heavy thud. "You look like a ghost that's been dragged through a briar patch," Mary said softly. "I feel like one," Abby admitted. She wrapped her bruised hands around the warm clay mug. "I saw the man with the silver star," Mary said. She took a slow sip of her tea. "He was in town this morning, asking questions at the general store." Abby looked up. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about you. Questions about the harvest. Questions about Silas Thorne." Mary set her mug down. "He has eyes, that one." Silas handed him a picture, but the cowboy is trying to see the landscape for himself. "He's a fool if he trusts Silas's papers," Abby muttered. "He's a man of the law," Mary corrected gently. "Men of the law love their paper. It makes the world simple. Good guys on this line, bad guys on that line. But life ain't written on lines, Abby." Abby stared out the kitchen window. The sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. Another day gone. Another day of fighting just to stay in the same place. "I'm so tired, Mary," Abby whispered. It was a confession she would never make to her children. "I do the work of 3 men. I keep this town fed when the winters turn mean. And yet I walk into town, and they look right through me, like I'm nothing." Mary reached across the table. Her warm, calloused hand covered Abby's bruised knuckles. "Listen to me, child," Mary said. Her voice held the deep, resonant rhythm of a tribal drum. It was a voice that commanded absolute attention. Abby looked at the older woman. "The pain you carry," Mary said, "is born from their ignorance, and it is a willful ignorance." Mary squeezed Abby's hand. "Recognizing the invisible struggles of marginalized people is the first step toward true compassion," Mary stated, the words clear and unbending. "True community love isn't smiling at church. It is seeing the sweat of the people the world ignores. If the men in this town actually recognize the invisible labor you do, they would have to treat you as an equal. They would have to respect you. But granting you respect means giving up their own power. So they choose to be blind." Abby let the words wash over her. They were heavy, but they were true. "They choose blindness," Mary repeated softly. "But that cowboy, the judge, his eyes are starting to open." Night fell hard over Oak Creek. The temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, howling through the pines. The house was quiet. Caleb and Sarah were asleep upstairs. The chores were done. The ledgers were updated. Abby stepped out onto the front porch. She didn't light a lantern. She wore her thick shawl. She sat down heavily in the wooden rocking chair. She didn't rock. She just sat there, staring out into the pitch-black void of the valley. In the dark, there was no need to be strong. She let her shoulders drop. She let the mask fall away. The sheer, crushing weight of her life pressed down on her chest. The loneliness, the constant, unending battle to prove she had a right to exist on the dirt she owned. She rubbed her face. A single silent tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Even in the dark, she refused to break. She gripped the wooden armrests of the chair, steadying her breathing. Enduring. She thought she was alone. She wasn't. 30 yards away, hidden in the thick shadows of the tree line, Wyatt Sterling sat perfectly still on his buckskin horse. He had ridden out here to check the perimeter. to see the farm at night. Silas had told him Abby wandered the property in the dark, screaming at ghosts. Wyatt watched her. He didn't see a hysterical woman. He didn't see madness. He saw a monument. He saw a woman sitting in the dark, bearing the weight of the world on her shoulders in absolute, unbroken silence. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her spine. He saw the iron will in the way she gripped the chair. Wyatt sat in the shadows for a long time. The wind bit through his cavalry coat. He didn't feel it. He thought about the file in his saddlebag. He thought about Silas Thorne's smooth smile. He thought about Abby's words from the day before. "You are using the laws of the powerful to judge the survival of the marginalized." Wyatt slowly reached a hand down and touched his silver star. It felt cold. It felt incredibly heavy. He backed his horse quietly into the trees. He turned toward town. He didn't know how he was going to fix this yet. But as he rode back into the dark, Wyatt Sterling knew one thing for absolute certain. The paper was a lie. Anger is a careless thing. It burns hot, it burns fast, and it leaves nothing but ash. Abby Winchester didn't have time for ash. She needed bricks. She needed something she could use to build a wall against Silas Thorne. So she didn't march down to the bank. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She sat at her kitchen table. She took out a fresh sheaf of paper. And she wrote. She didn't write an emotional plea. She wrote a legal petition. 11 pages long, addressed directly to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. She bypassed the local sheriff. She bypassed the county clerk. She went straight to the top of the mountain. She cited the territorial property laws. She cited the dates. She listed the exact amounts Silas Thorne had skimmed from her accounts. She included a notarized copy of her shadow ledger, stamped by Mary Blackwood and witnessed by the town's pastor. It took her 3 nights. Her hand cramped, her eyes blurred in the dim lamplight. But when she was done, it was a masterpiece. It was airtight. She sealed it in a thick brown envelope. She rode into town on a Tuesday morning, paid the stagecoach driver $2 silver directly, and watched him lock it in the Cheyenne mailbag. Silas Thorne didn't own the stagecoach. The letter was gone before he even woke up. But in a small town like Oak Creek, secrets don't stay buried. They sprout, and Silas had ears everywhere. By Thursday, he knew what she had done. He didn't come to the farm. Silas was a coward in a tailored suit. He didn't fight with his fists. He fought with whispers. He fought with the community. Friday morning, Abby hitched the wagon. She needed flour. She needed salt. Basic supplies to get through the month. Caleb offered to go. She told him no. She never hid behind her children. She drove the wagon down Main Street. The town felt different. The air was thick, heavy. She pulled up in front of the general store. Usually Mr. Higgins would step out, wipe his hands on his apron, and help her load the heavy sacks. Today the porch was empty. Abby tied off the horses. She stepped up onto the wooden boardwalk. Her boots struck the planks, heavy, rhythmic. She opened the door. The little bell rang. The store was crowded. 5 or 6 women from the local farms were picking over fabrics and dry goods. 2 men stood by the Cracker Barrel. The moment the bell rang, the talking stopped. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a sudden, absolute silence. Abby walked down the center aisle. She held her head high. She looked at Mrs. Miller, the same woman whose cow she had saved just days ago. Mrs. Miller looked down at the floor. She turned her back. Abby kept walking. She reached the counter. Mr. Higgins was wiping down the wood with a rag. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Morning, Arthur," Abby said. Her voice was steady. "Mrs. Winchester," he mumbled into his chest. "I need 50 pounds of flour, 10 of salt, and a tin of baking powder." Higgins stopped wiping the counter. He looked nervously toward the back room. He looked at the other women in the store. "I'm sorry, Abby," Higgins said softly. "I'm fresh out." Abby looked past him. Right behind him, stacked to the ceiling, were 50-pound sacks of white flour. Dozens of them. "You're out," Abby repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Spoken for. All of it." It was a lie, a bald, cowardly lie. Silas Thorne held the mortgage on Higgins's store. Silas had given the order: squeeze the widow, break her, make her a ghost in her own town. Abby didn't yell. She looked at Higgins, really looked at him, until the man began to sweat. "I understand, Arthur," she said. She turned around. She faced the store. The women were pretending to look at bolts of calico. The men were staring at the floorboards. Good, God-fearing people. People she had fed during the winter of '75. People she had helped, and they were letting her drown. Abby started walking toward the door. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a community turning its back. But before she reached the exit, the door swung open. Pastor Miller stepped inside. He was an older man, thin, gray-haired, but he walked with the righteous fury of an Old Testament prophet. He had been standing across the street. He had seen the whole thing. He didn't look at Abby, he looked at his congregation. He walked right to the center of the store. He slammed his walking stick hard against the floorboards. Crack! Everyone jumped. "I see the devil is doing a brisk trade in Oak Creek today," the pastor said. His voice was a baritone boom. It rattled the glass jars on the shelves. Mrs. Miller gasped, "Pastor, please!" "Quiet, Martha." He pointed his stick at her. Then he pointed it at Higgins. Then at the men by the barrel. "You call yourselves Christians," the pastor said, his voice vibrating with anger. "You sit in my pews. You sing the hymns. And yet you stand here today and participate in the starvation of a widow." "Mr. Thorne said," Higgins started. "I do not care what the banker said," the pastor roared. "Silas Thorne is not God, and his ledgers are not the Bible." He turned his back on Higgins and faced the entire room. He looked every single person in the eye. "Listen to me, and listen well," the pastor said, his voice dropping to a fierce, commanding register. "Silence in the face of injustice is the ultimate sin. Compassion isn't just an empty prayer you mumble on Sundays. It is having the courage to stand as a human shield for a widow when the entire system is trying to swallow her whole." The store was paralyzed. "When you turn your back on a woman who has bled for this earth," the pastor continued, making sure the lesson was unmistakably clear, "you are not just following orders. You are actively participating in her destruction. Moral courage requires action. If you will not stand up to a corrupt man with a fat wallet, then your faith is entirely worthless." He turned back to the counter. "Arthur," the pastor said softly but with steel in his jaw, "load the flour into Mrs. Winchester's wagon. Do it now." Higgins swallowed hard. He looked at the floor. He nodded. Abby stood by the door. She looked at the pastor. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. He gave her a single sharp nod. She walked out into the cold Wyoming air. The wind hit her face. She had her flour, she had her salt, but she also had a war. And Silas Thorne was going to make sure the whole town burned before he let her win. Wyatt Sterling couldn't sleep. He lay in the narrow bed at the Oak Creek boarding house, staring at the ceiling. He was a man who lived by the file. But the file didn't match the woman he had met. The file didn't match the woman he had seen sitting in the dark on her porch, carrying the weight of the world without breaking. He needed to know the truth, not Silas Thorne's truth, the real one. At dawn, Wyatt put on his coat. He walked down to the edge of town, to a small, rough-hewn cabin sitting by the creek. He knocked on the door. Mary Blackwood opened it. She was already dressed. She looked at the silver star on his chest, then up at his eyes. "You're up early, Cowboy," she said. "I need to see it," Wyatt said. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know she keeps a record. Her son mentioned it. I need to see what she wrote." Mary studied him. She looked for the lie. She didn't find it. She stepped aside. "Come in." Mary went to a floorboard under a woven rug. She pried it up. She pulled out a heavy leather-bound book, a copy of Abby's field ledger. She handed it to Wyatt. "Read it carefully, Judge. There's 14 years of blood in those pages." Wyatt sat at Mary's small wooden table. He opened the book. He read for 2 hours. He didn't find the ramblings of a madwoman. He found a masterpiece. He found complex crop rotations. He found meticulously calculated profit margins. He found a detailed account of an irrigation system that defied the natural slope of the valley. He found the handwriting of a brilliant, highly educated, fiercely logical mind. He closed the book. He felt sick to his stomach. Silas Thorne hadn't just lied. He had orchestrated the systematic erasure of a genius. Wyatt stood up. He left the cabin. He mounted his buckskin and rode straight out to the Winchester farm. The sun was high when he arrived. Abby wasn't at the house. He found her out in the western pasture. She was standing over a deep trench. She held a plumb line in her hands, checking the angle of the dirt wall. The water flowed perfectly, curving around a rocky outcrop without losing speed. Wyatt tied his horse to a fence post. He walked over. Abby didn't look up. "You here to serve me papers, Judge?" "No," Wyatt said. He stopped a few feet away. "I'm here to ask about the trench." Abby finally looked up. She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because I read your ledger," Wyatt said flatly. "Mary let me see it. And I don't understand how you're moving water uphill." Abby stood up straight. She wiped the mud from her hands with a rag. She looked at him for a long, silent moment. She was waiting for the trap. When none came, she pointed at the trench. "It's not moving uphill," Abby said. "It's an illusion. I read about the Mormon irrigation systems down in the Utah Territory. They use gravity and compression. By narrowing the trench at the curve, the water pressure builds. It pushes the flow up a slight incline before gravity takes it back down. It keeps the water from pooling and turning stagnant." Wyatt stared at the trench. He looked at the angles. It was brilliant. It was engineering that rivaled the Army Corps. "You designed this," Wyatt said. It wasn't a question. "I did," Abby replied. "Silas Thorne's file says your husband built the farm. It says you just kept the house." Abby let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "My husband was a good man, Judge, but he couldn't read a topographical map to save his life. He bought the dirt. I made it bleed green." Wyatt took off his hat. He ran a hand through his hair. He looked at this woman standing in the mud. She was dirty. She was tired. And she possessed a mind sharper than any politician he had ever met in Cheyenne. "I was wrong," Wyatt said. He looked her dead in the eye. "I came into this town with a file full of lies. And I let my own prejudice tell me a woman couldn't build a place like this. I was a fool." Abby didn't soften. She didn't smile. She stepped up out of the trench, standing on the grass right in front of him. "Being a fool is a choice, Wyatt," Abby said, her voice firm and clear. She looked at the silver star on his chest. "You need to understand something," Abby said, speaking deliberately, ensuring the lesson landed exactly where it needed to. "Wisdom has no gender. A sharp mind doesn't care if it belongs to a man in a suit or a woman in a mud-soaked dress." Wyatt held her gaze. He didn't argue. He listened. "True partnership, true justice, requires intellectual respect," Abby stated. Her words were a hammer striking steel. "If you look at a woman and assume her only value is in her silence, you are blinding yourself to half the brilliance in the world. Equality isn't just about letting me own my land. It is about looking at my mind and recognizing it as the equal to your own." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I recognize it, Abby. I see it." "Seeing it isn't enough," she challenged. "What are you going to do about it?" Wyatt put his hat back on, his jaw tightened. The cavalry captain was back. "I'm going to follow the money," Wyatt said. He left the farm. He rode back into Oak Creek like a man possessed. He didn't go to the bank. He went to the telegraph office. He flashed his federal badge at the operator. He cleared the room. Wyatt sat at the machine. He wired the Central Treasury in Cheyenne. He didn't ask about Abby Winchester. He asked about Silas Thorne. He asked for a full audit of Silas's territorial tax payments over the last 6 years. He waited 3 hours. He paced the wooden floor of the telegraph office. Finally, the machine began to clatter. The operator wrote down the message, his eyes going wide. He handed the slip of paper to Wyatt. Wyatt read it. A cold, hard smile touched the corner of his mouth. Silas Thorne was broke. Worse than broke. Silas owed the territorial government $40,000 from a failed railroad speculation back in '73. And to hide the debt, Silas had been forging documents. He had been quietly using the deeds of the widows and orphans he supervised as illegal collateral to keep the government off his back. If Abby won her farm back, Silas's house of cards would collapse. He would hang. Wyatt folded the telegram and slipped it into his breast pocket. He walked out onto the dusty street. He looked down toward the bank. The file was a lie. The banker was a thief. And the woman in the mud was the only honest thing in this whole damn valley. Wyatt touched his silver star. It was time to go to war. Power is a quiet thing. It doesn't always roar. It doesn't always shoot. Most of the time, it just signs a piece of paper in a warm room, miles away from the people it destroys. Silas Thorne was a man of power, and he was panicking. He had seen Wyatt Sterling walk out of the telegraph office. He had seen the hard, flat look in the judge's eye. Silas didn't know exactly what the telegraph said, but he knew what it meant. The cowboy had stopped reading the file. The cowboy was looking at the ledger. Silas didn't confront Wyatt. That wasn't his way. He went to his heavy mahogany desk. He pulled out a piece of fine, watermarked stationery. He wrote a letter to the territorial governor in Cheyenne, a man who owed Silas a great deal of money from a bad silver mine investment. The message was simple. Judge Sterling is acting erratically. He is compromised. Remove him from Oak Creek immediately or your debts will become public. The response came down the wire the very next morning. Wyatt Sterling was sitting in the boarding house dining room. He was drinking black coffee. He was planning his next move against the bank. A deputy walked in. He looked nervous. He handed Wyatt a sealed envelope. Wyatt opened it. General Order 44 to Judge Wyatt Sterling. You are hereby relieved of all judicial duties in Oak Creek, effective immediately. You are ordered to return to Cheyenne. Your current caseload is transferred to the local magistrate. Wyatt stared at the paper. It was a kill shot. Clean, legal, absolute. If he defied a direct federal order, he wasn't just out of a job. He lost his pension. He lost his badge. He could face a military tribunal. He had spent his whole life following the chain of command, the cavalry, the courts, the law. He folded the paper. He put it in his pocket. He walked upstairs to his room. He pulled his saddlebags from the closet. He started packing his shirts. 10 miles away, the sun was starting to set over the Winchester farm. Abby was in the kitchen. She was chopping carrots for a stew. Caleb was out back chopping firewood. The rhythm of the axe rang out in the cold evening air. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Then the axe stopped. Abby looked up. She heard the sound of heavy horses. Multiple horses. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked out onto the front porch. Sheriff Miller was riding up the drive. He wasn't alone. He had 3 deputies with him, and riding right behind them in a sleek black buggy was Silas Thorne. Abby's heart gave a hard, sudden thump against her ribs, but her face didn't change. Evening, Sheriff, Abby said. Her voice was steady. Miller wouldn't look her in the eye. He dismounted. He pulled a rolled-up piece of paper from his belt. Mrs. Winchester, Miller said. His voice was thick, uncomfortable. I have a court order here, signed by the local magistrate an hour ago. Caleb came running around the side of the house. He still held the axe. Boy, you put that down, a deputy barked, resting a hand on his holster. Caleb, put it down, Abby commanded. She didn't yell, but the tone allowed no argument. Caleb lowered the axe. He stood next to his mother. His breathing was fast, shallow. Read it, Sheriff, Abby said. Miller unrolled the paper. He cleared his throat. By order of the county court, the property known as the Winchester Farm is hereby placed in foreclosure due to unmanageable debt and the mental unfitness of the current resident. Custody of the property reverts to the financial overseer, Mr. Silas Thorne. Abby felt the ground tilt. Foreclosure. There is no debt. I don't owe the bank a single dime. The court disagrees, Abby, Silas called out from his buggy. He smiled. A thin, bloodless smile. The books have been audited. You are severely in the red. The territory cannot allow a vital agricultural asset to fall into ruin. You forged those books, Caleb yelled, taking a step forward. Restrain the boy if he threatens you, deputies, Silas said smoothly. Nobody touches my son. Abby stepped in front of Caleb. She looked back at Miller. Judge Sterling is investigating this case. He has federal jurisdiction over the local magistrate. Miller finally looked at her. His eyes were full of pity. Judge Sterling has been recalled to Cheyenne, Abby. The telegraph came this morning. He's off the case. He's leaving town. The words hit her like a physical blow. He's leaving. The one man who had looked at the truth. The one man who had seen her. He was packing his bags. He was riding away. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises, Sheriff Miller said softly. Tomorrow at sundown we will come back. We will board up the doors. Anything left inside becomes property of the bank. I'm sorry, Abby. I really am. Miller turned around. He mounted his horse. The deputies followed. Silas Thorne tipped his hat to her, turned his buggy, and drove away. The yard went dead silent. The cold wind blew off the ridge. It cut right through Abby's thin cotton dress. 14 years. 14 years of mud, of freezing rain, of pulling calves in the dark, of bleeding into the dirt to keep her children fed. Gone. Erased by a signature. She looked at Caleb. The boy was crying. Angry, silent tears tracing paths through the dirt on his face. Sarah was standing in the doorway. She was trembling. Abby couldn't breathe. The iron walls she had built around her heart for 14 years began to crack. The sheer, crushing weight of the injustice was too much. The machine was too big. She couldn't fight the whole world alone. Saddle the roan, Caleb, Abby whispered. Her voice was hoarse, broken. Ma, it's almost dark. Saddle the horse, she screamed. It was the first time she had ever screamed at him. 10 minutes later, she was riding, hard. She didn't take the wagon road. She cut through the pine trees. She pushed the roan to a dangerous gallop in the fading light. Pine branches whipped against her face. She didn't feel them. She didn't feel the cold. She only felt terror. Blind, consuming terror for her children. She hit the edge of town just as the street lamps were being lit. She rode straight for the boarding house. Wyatt Sterling was walking out the front door. He carried his heavy saddlebags over one shoulder. He was walking toward the livery stable, toward his horse. Abby pulled back on the reins so hard the roan reared up, hooves kicking the dirt. She threw herself off the saddle before the horse even landed. She hit the ground hard. She stumbled to her knees in the dusty street. Wyatt dropped his saddlebags. He took a step toward her. Abby! She scrambled up. She ran to him. She didn't stop. She hit his chest, her hands grabbing the thick wool of his cavalry coat. She held onto him like a drowning woman holding onto a piece of driftwood. And then she broke. The Iron Woman of Oak Creek. The woman who hadn't cried when her husband was buried. The woman who stared down blizzards. She shattered. Great, racking sobs tore out of her chest. Her knees gave way. Wyatt caught her. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her up as she wept into his coat. Please, she choked out. Her voice was unrecognizable, wild, desperate. Please don't leave us. Abby, what happened? Wyatt asked, his voice tight. They're taking it, she sobbed, burying her face in his chest. Silas got an order. The sheriff came. 24 hours. They're throwing my babies out into the snow. Please, I can't stop him. I can't fight them all. Wyatt looked over her head. He looked down the street toward the bank. Please don't leave us, she sobbed again, her fingers twisting into his coat. If you ride away, they will kill the truth. My children have done nothing wrong. Please, don't leave us to the wolves. Wyatt held her tight. He could feel her shaking. He could feel the utter devastation of a human being completely crushed by a corrupt machine. He looked at his saddlebags lying in the dirt. He thought about his orders. He thought about his pension. Then he looked down at the woman weeping in his arms. Wyatt pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She looked utterly defeated. "Listen to me," Wyatt said. His voice was low, but it carried a dangerous, quiet thunder. He held her shoulders. He made sure she was looking right at him. "When the system fails," Wyatt said, speaking the words clearly, deliberately, so she would never forget them, "individuals must step out of their comfort zones to protect the innocent. A man who follows a corrupt order to save his own skin isn't a man of the law. He's just a coward with a badge." Abby stared at him, the sobbing hitched in her throat. "Choosing humanity over comfort is the only thing that separates us from the animals," Wyatt stated, his jaw set like granite. "I was ordered back to Cheyenne. I was ordered to look the other way." He reached up. He unpinned the silver star from his leather vest. He looked at it for a second. Then he threw it into the dirt. "I'm not going anywhere," Wyatt said. He bent down. He picked up his saddlebags. He looked at the livery stable. Then he looked toward the town hall. "Go back to your children, Abby," Wyatt said softly. He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with a rough thumb. "Lock your doors, put some coffee on the stove, and do not pack a single box." "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Wyatt Sterling turned his head. He looked down the dark street toward the bank. "I'm going to burn Silas Thorne to the ground." The morning air in Wyoming is sharp enough to cut glass. It was 8 o'clock. The town of Oak Creek was waking up. Shopkeepers were sweeping their porches. The livery boy was pitching hay, and Wyatt Sterling was walking down the center of Main Street with a shotgun resting on his shoulder. He didn't have his silver star. He didn't need it. He walked straight to the Oak Creek Town Hall, a sturdy, whitewashed building with a heavy oak door. He stepped inside. The local magistrate, a fat man named Higgins who owed his job to Silas Thorne, was sitting behind the bench, eating a biscuit. Wyatt walked up to the bench. He racked the shotgun. The sound echoed like a cannon shot in the empty room. Higgins dropped his biscuit. "Get out of my chair," Wyatt said. "Judge Sterling," Higgins stammered, wiping crumbs from his chin. "You were recalled. You have no jurisdiction here. I have a telegram from Cheyenne." "And I have a 12-gauge, Wyatt replied evenly. "Under Territorial Emergency Clause 8, a federal investigator can suspend local authority in the event of an active, ongoing fraud against the United States government. Now get out of my chair." Higgins scrambled off the bench. He ran out the back door. Wyatt set the shotgun on the desk. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his coat. He sat down. 10 minutes later, Silas Thorne walked through the front doors. Silas was wearing a tailored suit. He looked relaxed, smug. He had heard about the shotgun. He assumed it was the desperate flailing of a defeated man. He brought Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies with him. "Wyatt," Silas said, smiling. He walked down the center aisle, stopping right in front of the bench. "This is highly irregular. You are trespassing. You are violating a direct order from the governor." Wyatt didn't look up from his papers. "Sit down, Silas." "I will do no such thing," Silas sneered. "Sheriff Miller, arrest this man for impersonating a federal officer." Miller hesitated. He put a hand on his gun belt. "Wyatt, don't make me do this. Come quietly." Wyatt finally looked up. He looked at Miller. "Sheriff," Wyatt said calmly, "I have a telegram here from the Central Treasury in Cheyenne. It details a $40,000 debt owed by Silas Thorne to the territorial government. It also details the fraudulent use of private deeds, including the Winchester farm, as illegal collateral. If you arrest me, you are officially an accomplice to federal bank fraud. You will hang right next to him." Miller froze. He took his hand off his gun. He took a slow step away from Silas. Silas's smile vanished. His face went dead white. "That is a lie. You fabricated that wire." "Take a seat, Silas," Wyatt repeated. "We're holding a public tribunal, right here, right now." The doors to the town hall opened. People started filing in. The blacksmith, the grocer, Pastor Miller. They had heard the commotion. They filled the wooden pews. And then Abby Winchester walked in. She wasn't crying. Her face was washed. Her back was straight. She walked down the aisle and sat in the front row. Caleb and Sarah sat beside her. Silas looked around the room. He realized the trap was closing. But he was a rat, and rats always look for a hole. "You have no proof of anything," Silas shouted, turning back to Wyatt. "You have a piece of paper about a debt. That has nothing to do with Abby Winchester's farm. She is mentally unfit. The law clearly states that a woman cannot hold a deed without a competent male guardian. Her husband is dead. The county appointed me. The law is the law." "The law requires accurate records," Wyatt countered. "You claim you managed the farm. You claim you built the fences in '74. You claim you ordered the quarantines." "I did," Silas barked. "I have the ledgers to prove it. I filed them with the county myself." Wyatt looked past Silas. He looked at the back doors. "Call the witness," Wyatt said. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Mary Blackwood walked in. The room went dead silent. The townsfolk stared. Mary hadn't been inside the town hall in 20 years. She walked with a slow, steady dignity. Her moccasins made no sound on the floorboards. She walked past Silas. She stood beside the witness stand. "Objection!" Silas yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "She is a Cherokee. Her testimony is inadmissible under territorial property laws. She has no legal standing in this court." Wyatt picked up a wooden gavel. He slammed it down. Bang! "Overruled," Wyatt said. "You can't do that," Silas screamed. Wyatt leaned forward over the bench. His eyes were cold fire. "I just did." Wyatt looked at Mary. "State your name for the record, ma'am." "Mary Blackwood," she said, her voice carried to the back of the room. "How long have you lived in Oak Creek?" "Before the creek had a name," Mary replied. "Have you observed the Winchester farm over the last 14 years?" "Every day," Mary said. Wyatt picked up Abby's shadow ledger, the one Mary had kept hidden under her floorboards. He held it up. "Do you recognize this book?" "I do," Mary said. "I watched Abby Winchester write in it. Every night for 6 years. And I signed the bottom of every page." "Did Silas Thorne ever set foot on that farm to dig a trench?" Wyatt asked. "No." "Did he ever pull a calf? Did he ever swing a hammer? Did he ever make a single decision about the crops?" "No," Mary said. She turned and looked directly at Silas. "He only came to collect the money. He is a parasite. He eats what others grow." The crowd in the pews began to murmur. The whispers grew louder. The town was finally seeing the monster behind the tailored suit. Silas was sweating profusely. He gripped the wooden railing. "This is a farce. You are listening to an Indian and a madwoman. The law says the property belongs under my guardianship." Wyatt stood up. He didn't pick up the gavel. He didn't need it. The sheer force of his presence commanded the room. "Mr. Thorne," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "you have hidden behind the word law for 6 years. You have used it as a shield to steal from the vulnerable." Wyatt walked around the bench. He stepped down until he was standing on the same floor as Silas. He looked out at the townspeople. He looked at Abby. "Listen to me, all of you," Wyatt said. His voice rang out, clear and unbroken. "The legal system must serve human rights," Wyatt declared, making sure every person in the room heard the words. "It was not designed to serve as a weapon for the greedy. When a system allows a man who has never touched a plow to steal the harvest from a woman who bled for it, that system is broken." Silas opened his mouth to speak. Wyatt pointed a finger at him, silencing him instantly. "Equality is an inherent birthright," Wyatt stated, the educational weight of the words landing like heavy stones. "It is not a favor granted by a magistrate. It is not something you beg for. Any statute, any law, any piece of paper that forbids a mother from owning the soil she poured her life into is a statute that must be struck down." Wyatt turned back to Silas. "The foreclosure is canceled," Wyatt said. "Your guardianship is permanently revoked, and based on this federal wire, You are under arrest for fraud." Silas staggered back. "You can't. You don't have the badge anymore." Wyatt looked at Sheriff Miller. Miller stepped forward. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt. He looked at Silas Thorne. "Hands behind your back, Silas," Miller said softly. Silas fought. He screamed. He threatened. It didn't matter. The illusion of his power was gone. The deputies dragged him out the back door toward the jailhouse. The town hall erupted in noise. People were talking, shouting, clapping. Wyatt ignored them all. He walked over to the front row. Abby was still sitting there. She looked up at him. The sheer relief in her eyes was staggering. The heavy, crushing weight of 14 years was finally off her chest. Wyatt looked at her. He didn't smile. He just gave her a single respectful nod. "Go home, Mrs. Winchester," Wyatt said quietly. "Your farm is safe." Abby stood up. She reached out. She didn't hug him this time. She took his rough, scarred hand in her own blistered, calloused hands. She squeezed it tight. "Thank you," she whispered. The truth had finally spoken, and it was louder than any lie the law could tell. Silence is different when you own it. For 14 years, the silence on the Winchester farm had been heavy. It was the silence of holding your breath, the silence of waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for a banker in a tailored suit to ride up and take it all away. Today, the silence was just quiet. It was a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks since the trial in the town hall. 2 weeks since Silas Thorne had been loaded into a prison wagon under heavy guard, bound for a federal cell in Cheyenne. Abby sat on her front porch. She held a mug of black coffee. The steam curled up into the crisp morning air. She looked out over the south pasture. The cattle were grazing. The fences stood tall and straight. The dirt was damp from a late-night rain. It smelled like wet sage and pine. It smelled like hers. A rider crested the low ridge at the edge of the property. A tall man on a buckskin gelding. He wore a faded blue cavalry coat. Wyatt Sterling. Abby didn't stand up. She didn't run to the edge of the yard. She just sat and watched him ride in. He took his time. He didn't ride like a man bringing trouble. He rode like a man bringing an end to it. Wyatt tied his horse to the hitching post. He took off his hat. He walked up the wooden steps of the porch. He didn't have his saddlebags today. He just had a single thick envelope made of heavy brown paper. "Morning, Abby," Wyatt said. His voice was rough, quiet. "Morning, Wyatt. Coffee is hot on the stove. Cups are on the counter. I'll pass. Thank you." He stood there for a moment. He looked out at the farm. He looked at the irrigation trenches cutting through the dirt. Then he looked down at the envelope in his hands. "The wire came through late last night," Wyatt said, "from the governor's office. The Territorial Supreme Court reviewed the transcripts from the tribunal." Abby set her mug down on the wooden railing. She didn't say a word. She just waited. "Silas Thorne's guardianship is permanently dissolved," Wyatt continued. His voice was steady, official. "The court found gross negligence, fraud, malfeasance. Every dollar he skimmed from your accounts over the last 6 years has been added to his restitution. You'll get it back. All of it." Wyatt held out the brown envelope. "This is the new deed," he said, "drafted in Cheyenne, signed by the territorial judge. It names you, Abigail Winchester, as the sole proprietor and legal guardian of this estate. It is yours, free and clear. Nobody can ever touch it again." Abby looked at the envelope. 14 years. She had bled for this dirt. She had frozen for it. She had nearly lost her mind trying to hold on to it. And now it was sitting in a paper envelope in a cowboy's hand. She reached out. She took it. It didn't feel heavy. It just felt like paper. She didn't open it. She set it on the small table next to her rocking chair. Then she looked back at Wyatt. "Thank you," she said. Wyatt shook his head. He looked down at the floorboards. "Don't thank me, Abby," he said softly. "I almost rode away. I almost left you to the wolves. But you didn't." "I should have seen it sooner," Wyatt said. His jaw tightened. The guilt was eating at him. It had been eating at him for 2 weeks. I rode into this valley with a badge on my chest and a head full of pride. I let a corrupt man hand me a piece of paper, and I believed it. Because it was easy. Because the law told me a woman couldn't build a place like this. I was blind, and my blindness almost cost you everything. He looked up, he met her eyes. I am sorry, Abby. I am profoundly, deeply sorry. For all of it. It was a good apology. It was honest. It was raw. A lesser woman might have softened. A lesser woman might have smiled, taken his hand, and told him it was all in the past. Abby Winchester was not a lesser woman. She didn't smile. She didn't reach for his hand. She sat up straight in her chair. "Sit down, Wyatt," she said. He pulled up a wooden stool. He sat. He kept his hat in his hands. "You're a good man," Abby said. Her voice was rhythmic, measured. "You stood up to Silas Thorne. You threw your badge in the dirt for me, and I will never forget that. But you need to understand something about apologies." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I'm listening." Abby leaned forward. Her dark eyes locked onto his. "Forgiveness doesn't come from a simple apology, Wyatt," she said. Her words were deliberate, each one landing with absolute clarity. "It doesn't come from feeling guilty. And it doesn't come from handing me a piece of paper that belonged to me in the first place." Wyatt didn't blink. He took the words. He knew she was right. "It comes from you using your privilege to fix the machine," Abby stated. The educational weight of her words hung in the cold morning air. "Silas Thorne didn't almost destroy my family because he was a monster. He almost destroyed my family because the system allowed him to. The law gave him the weapon. You represent that law." She pointed a finger at his chest, right where his silver star used to be. "True social healing happens only when men with power are willing to change the rules," Abby continued, her voice ringing with hard-earned wisdom. "You want my forgiveness? You want to make this right? Then make sure no woman in this territory ever has to beg for her own life again." Wyatt looked at her pointing finger. Then he looked at her face. He didn't get defensive. He didn't argue. He let the truth of her words settle into his bones. "You're asking me to change the territorial land code," Wyatt said. "I'm telling you to change the territorial land code," Abby corrected. "I want a new verification procedure. If a man claims guardianship over a widow's property, I want an independent audit. I want mandatory interviews with the woman in question. I want a system that is blind to gender and focused entirely on the truth of the labor. Can you do that?" Wyatt thought about it. It would mean fighting the old guard in Cheyenne. It would mean endless arguments with politicians who liked things exactly the way they were. It would be a brutal, exhausting bureaucratic war. He looked at Abby's calloused hands. It was nothing compared to the war she had already fought. Wyatt put his hat back on his head. He pulled the brim down low over his eyes. "I'll draft the new procedures tonight," Wyatt said. "I'll wire them to Cheyenne in the morning. I'll tell the governor I won't accept my reinstatement unless they adopt the protocols territory-wide." Abby looked at him. She saw the iron in his jaw. She knew he meant it. "Then you have my forgiveness, Judge Sterling," Abby said softly. Wyatt nodded. He stood up. He walked down the porch steps. He untied his buckskin. Before he mounted up, he looked back at the porch. "You're a terrifying woman, Abby Winchester," he said. There was a ghost of a smile on his lips. "It's a terrifying world, Wyatt," she replied. "I just learned how to match it." He swung up into the saddle. He tipped his hat, and he rode back toward town. Abby watched him go. Then she looked down at the brown envelope on the table. She picked it up. She broke the wax seal. She pulled out the heavy parchment. Abigail Winchester, sole proprietor. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just breathed in the cold Wyoming air. It tasted like freedom. And then she went inside to wash the coffee cups. The farm wasn't going to run itself. A wound heals, but it always leaves a scar. Oak Creek was scarred. The town had been ripped apart by the trial. Neighbors who had sat in the same church pews for a decade suddenly couldn't look each other in the eye. The people who had stood by Silas Thorne were ashamed. The people who had looked the other way were embarrassed. A heavy, awkward tension hung over Main Street like a low winter fog. Abby felt it every time she drove her wagon into town. She saw the women, the farmers' wives, the widows, women like Martha Miller, whose cow Abby had saved just days before the town turned its back on her. Martha would see Abby coming down the boardwalk and quickly turn her face. She would stare into the mercantile window, pretending to be fascinated by a bolt of blue calico. Abby didn't hate her. Hate takes too much energy. And Abby understood something fundamental about Oak Creek. Those women hadn't turned their backs because they were evil. They turned their backs because they were terrified. They were completely dependent on men like Silas Thorne. They couldn't read a bank ledger. They didn't know how to calculate interest. If their husbands died tomorrow, they would be exactly where Abby had been, trapped, blind, helpless. Ignorance was a chain, and Abby knew exactly how to break it. It was a Thursday evening, mid-November. The first real snow of the season was falling, dusting the valley floor in a coat of brilliant white. Abby's barn was warm. She had lit 4 kerosene lanterns and hung them from the center beams. She had dragged 6 wooden benches from the old meeting house and arranged them in a semicircle. At the front of the barn, she had set up a large chalkboard she bought from the schoolhouse in Cheyenne. By 7 o'clock, the barn was full. There were 15 women sitting on the benches. Martha Miller was there. Sarah Jenkins, a young widow from the North Ridge, was there. Even Mary Blackwood sat in the back row, her dark eyes watching the room with quiet approval. They looked nervous. They clutched their shawls. They didn't know why Abby had invited them. Some thought it was a trap, a chance for the victorious widow to gloat, to publicly shame them for their cowardice. Abby walked to the front of the room. She didn't look angry. She looked like a woman with a job to do. She carried a stack of small, leather-bound books. She walked down the aisle. She handed one book to each woman. Martha Miller looked down at the blank pages. Her hands trembled. "Abby, what is this?" Abby walked back to the front of the room. She picked up a piece of white chalk. "That is a ledger," Abby said. Her voice was clear. It cut through the nervous whispers in the barn. "It is exactly like the one I used to save my farm." The women stared at her. "I know why you looked away from me at the store, Martha," Abby said. She didn't sound bitter. She sounded practical. "I know why all of you stayed quiet. You stayed quiet because Silas Thorne held your mortgages, because you don't know what the numbers on those mortgage papers mean. You let your husbands or the bankers or the judges handle the math, because the law tells you it's not a woman's place." A few of the women looked down at their boots. The shame was heavy. "Look at me," Abby commanded gently. They looked up. Abby tapped the chalkboard with the piece of chalk. Tap, tap. "That shame you feel right now, that is exactly how they control you," Abby said. She spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure the lesson took root in the dirt of their minds. "Listen to me, all of you," Abby stated, her voice ringing out in the warm light of the lanterns. "Educating yourself is the greatest armor you can forge. A gun can be taken from your hand. A piece of land can be stolen by a corrupt judge. But the ability to read a contract? The ability to calculate the yield of your own harvest? No man can ever take that out of your head." Martha Miller ran a hand over the leather cover of the blank book. "I don't know numbers, Abby. My father never let me go to school past the 3rd grade." "Then you will learn them tonight," Abby said flatly. She turned to the chalkboard. She wrote down 3 words in large block letters: revenue, expense, profit. "When you know how to read a contract," Abby explained, tapping the words, "when you know how to calculate a yield, no man, whether he's a banker, a sheriff, or a judge, can ever look right through you and pretend you are invisible. Numbers are the language of power in this territory. And starting tonight, we are going to learn how to speak it." She turned back to the room. "Open your books to the first page," Abby said. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors. Then, slowly, Martha Miller opened her book. Sarah Jenkins opened hers. One by one, 15 women opened their ledgers to the blank white page. Abby smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Good," she said. "Now, let's talk about the price of winter wheat." The change in Oak Creek didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a slow, steady shift. Like a glacier carving out a new valley. You could see the change in the small things. You could see it in the general store. When Arthur Higgins tried to short Sarah Jenkins on the price of her eggs, Sarah didn't just nod and accept it. She pulled out a small leather book from her apron. She ran her finger down a column of numbers. She looked Higgins dead in the eye and told him he owed her 40 cents more. Higgins paid her. He didn't argue. You could see the change in the children. It was a Sunday afternoon. The Winchester farmhouse was warm. The smell of roasting beef and potatoes filled the kitchen. Caleb was sitting at the heavy oak table. He was 17 now. His shoulders were broader. His hands were thicker. He looked like a man. He was holding a pencil. He was staring at a piece of paper. Across the table sat his 12-year-old sister, Sarah. She had her own ledger open. "You forgot to carry the two, Caleb," Sarah said, pointing her small finger at a column of numbers. "If we buy the Hereford bull from the Miller farm, the feed cost goes up by 12%. You only calculated 10. A year ago, Caleb might have snapped at her. A year ago, he might have told her to mind her own business and go help their mother with the dishes. He had been raised in a world that told him men did the math and women did the cooking. But Caleb had watched his mother break that world in half. Caleb looked at the numbers. He erased his total. He rewrote it. "You're right," Caleb said easily. He didn't look angry. He looked proud. 12%. Good catch, Sarah. That saves us $20 by spring. He didn't patronize her. He didn't brush her off. He treated her like an absolute equal. Because she was. Over by the fireplace, sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair, Mary Blackwood watched the two children. She was smoking a small clay pipe. Sarah closed her ledger. She walked over to Mary. She sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fire. "Tell me the story about the winter of the deep snow, Mary," Sarah asked. "The one where the elk came down into the valley." Mary smiled. Her lined face crinkled in the firelight. "Are you going to write it down in your book, little one?" "No," Sarah said seriously. She tapped the side of her head. "Ma says the numbers go in the book. The history goes in here. You said the Cherokee keep the history alive by speaking it. I want to learn how to keep it." "Then listen closely," Mary said softly. The snow started on a Tuesday. Outside the farmhouse, a man sat on a buckskin horse. Wyatt Sterling had ridden out from town. He was still the land judge. But he didn't carry fabricated files anymore. His new verification protocols had been adopted by Cheyenne. The territory was changing. Slowly. Painfully. But it was changing. He looked through the kitchen window. He saw Abby at the stove. He saw Caleb doing math. He saw Sarah listening to the ancient history of the land from an elder. He saw a fortress, not built of wood and stone, but built of knowledge, built of mutual respect, built of a mother's unbreakable will to forge armor for the people she loved. Wyatt didn't knock on the door. He didn't need to interrupt. He just sat on his horse in the falling snow, watching the warm lights spill out from the window. He listened to the quiet, steady rhythm of a healed world. He touched the brim of his hat in a silent salute. Then, the cowboy turned his horse and rode back into the winter night. The envelope was thick, heavy cream-colored paper. It sat on the small wooden desk in Wyatt Sterling's room at the boarding house. It had a red wax seal, the seal of the territorial governor of Wyoming. Wyatt stared at it. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. He had felt this coming for weeks. The trial of Silas Thorne had made noise, a lot of noise. You don't arrest the most powerful banker in the county, expose a massive federal fraud, and expect the capital to stay quiet. Cheyenne had noticed. The governor had noticed. Wyatt picked up a brass letter opener. He broke the red wax. He pulled out the single sheet of paper. To Judge Wyatt Sterling. In recognition of your exceptional service and decisive action in Oak Creek County, you are hereby promoted. You are appointed as the Chief Magistrate of the Eastern District stationed in Laramie. Report to your new post by the 1st of December. A promotion. More money. More power. A permanent office with a heavy oak desk and a coal stove that never went out. No more riding through blizzards. No more sleeping in cheap boarding houses with thin walls. It was everything he had worked for since he took off his cavalry uniform 12 years ago. It was the top of the mountain. He set the letter down. He looked out the frost-covered window. The street below was quiet. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, burying the dirt, burying the tracks of the wagons. He should have felt a rush of pride. He should have felt victorious. He felt entirely hollow. Wyatt turned away from the window. He pulled his leather saddlebags from the corner of the room. He tossed them onto the bed. He opened his wooden trunk. He started folding his shirts. He packed his shaving kit. He packed his extra boots. He packed like a man who was following orders. Because that was what Wyatt Sterling did. He followed the paper. He buckled the leather straps. He threw the bags over his shoulder. He walked downstairs, paid his bill, and walked out into the cold. He saddled the buckskin. He rode out of town. But he didn't turn east toward Laramie. He turned north toward the Winchester farm. The ride was freezing. The wind bit through his heavy coat. Wyatt didn't care. He needed to do this right. He needed to look her in the eye. When he crested the ridge, the farm looked like a fortress against the winter. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. The cattle were herded tight in the winter pens. The barn doors were shut against the wind. Abby was on the front porch. She wore a heavy wool coat. She was stacking firewood against the wall, preparing for the deep freeze. She saw the horse. She stopped moving. Wyatt rode into the yard. He dismounted. He tied the buckskin to the rail. He walked up the steps. His boots crunched on the snow. "Morning, Wyatt," Abby said, her breath plumed in the freezing air. "Morning, Abby." She looked at him. She looked at his horse. She saw the heavy saddlebags. She saw the bedroll tied tight behind the cantle. Abby Winchester was a woman who saw everything. "You're packed," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Wyatt said. He took off his hat. "I received a dispatch from Cheyenne this morning. Orders from the governor. They're moving you. They're promoting me. Chief Magistrate in Laramie. I'm supposed to report by the 1st of the month." Abby stood very still. She looked at the snow falling in the yard. She didn't drop the piece of firewood she was holding. She just held it tighter. "Laramie is a big town," Abby said quietly. "Good for a man looking to build a name." "It's a desk job," Wyatt said. "Inside, out of the weather. You earned it." Wyatt looked at her. He wanted her to say something else. He wanted her to ask him to stay. He wanted her to give him a reason to fight the orders. But Abby didn't beg. That wasn't who she was. "Come inside," Abby said. "It's too cold to stand out here and talk about goodbye." She turned and went into the house. Wyatt followed. The kitchen was warm. The smell of burning pine and fresh coffee filled the room. Caleb and Sarah were down at the barn, feeding the stock. The house was quiet. Abby went to the stove. She poured 2 cups of black coffee. She set one down on the heavy oak table. She sat down. Wyatt sat across from her. They didn't speak for a long minute. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "When do you ride out?" Abby asked. "Tomorrow morning." Abby took a sip of her coffee. She set the mug down. She looked across the table, her dark eyes locked onto his. "I want to ask you a question, Wyatt," Abby said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic. "And I need the truth. I don't want a polite answer. I want the real one." Wyatt nodded. "Ask it. Have you thought about what comes after you leave Oak Creek?" Wyatt traced the rim of his coffee mug with his thumb. I've thought about Laramie, Wyatt said slowly. I've thought about the new office. I've thought about sitting behind a desk and reading files from men who think they own the world. He stopped. He looked up at her. And I've thought about here, Wyatt said. His voice dropped. Rough, honest. Here is a place, Abby said. What exactly have you thought about? Wyatt didn't blink. I've thought about the fact that for 12 years I've ridden from town to town. I've fixed broken paper. I've enforced laws written by other men. But I haven't built a damn thing. Not a fence, not a home, not a life. I've just been passing through. Abby listened. She didn't interrupt. And then I came here, Wyatt continued. And I met a woman who built a world with her bare hands. A woman who looked a corrupt system in the eye and broke it in half. I've thought about how quiet it's going to be in Laramie, and how much I'm going to hate that quiet. Abby took a slow breath. I am not a woman who waits, Wyatt, Abby said. The rhythm of her words was a drum beat in the quiet kitchen. I am not going to build my life around a man's shadow. I don't wonder if a man is going to stay or go. I did that once. I organized my whole life around what my husband wanted, and it didn't protect me from a single thing when he died. She leaned forward. I survived, Abby said. I fought. I won. I can run this farm alone. I can raise my children alone. I don't need a savior, and I don't need a judge. Wyatt held her gaze. I know. But, Abby said, her voice softening just a fraction, I am also not a woman who lies to herself, and I won't lie to you. I have learned to stand on my own 2 feet, but I won't be sorry if you don't ride to Laramie. It was not a declaration of desperate, burning romance. It was not a woman throwing herself at a man's feet. It was a statement of absolute, terrifying equality. It was the truth of a woman who was finally free enough to choose what she wanted rather than clinging to what she needed. Wyatt looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the calluses on her hands. He saw the only thing in the world he actually wanted. He stood up. He didn't kiss her. He didn't make a grand speech. Thank you for the coffee, Abby, Wyatt said. He put his hat on. He walked out the door. He mounted his buckskin. And he rode away. Abby sat at the table. She listened to the sound of the horse fading into the snow. She didn't cry. She picked up her coffee mug. She drank it. Then she went back to work. Wyatt didn't ride to Laramie. He rode straight back to Oak Creek. He went to the telegraph office. He grabbed a slip of yellow paper. He dipped a pen in ink. He wrote a single sentence to the territorial governor in Cheyenne. I decline the promotion. I am staying in Oak Creek. He handed it to the operator. The operator read it. His eyes went wide. Judge Sterling, are you sure you're throwing away a chief magistrate position? Send it, Wyatt said. He walked out of the office. He went to the boarding house. He unpacked his saddlebags. He unpacked his shirts. He put his boots in the closet. Then he sat down at his desk. He pulled out a piece of legal parchment. He began to write. He didn't write a court order. He didn't write a legal brief. He wrote a contract. It took him 3 hours to get the wording exactly right. He wanted it ironclad. He wanted it undeniable in any court in the territory. The next morning, the snow had stopped. The sun was blindingly bright against the white valley. Wyatt saddled his horse. He rode back to the Winchester farm. Abby was in the barn, pitching hay to the horses. Caleb was beside her. Wyatt walked into the barn. He carried a single piece of paper. Abby stopped pitching. She looked at him. She looked at the paper. I sent a wire to Cheyenne yesterday, Wyatt said. His voice echoed in the cavernous barn. I turned down the promotion. I'm staying in Oak Creek. Caleb stopped working. He leaned against his pitchfork. He looked at Wyatt with a newfound respect. Abby slowly lowered her pitchfork. Why? Because Laramie is a desk. This is a life. Wyatt walked toward her. But I didn't come here to ask for a job as a farmhand, and I didn't come here to ask you to marry me. Abby's brow furrowed. Then what is that paper? Wyatt held it out. Let's go to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, they were sitting at the heavy oak table. Caleb and Sarah were standing by the stove, watching quietly. Wyatt slid the paper across the wood. Abby picked it up. She read the heading. Partnership Agreement. She read the terms. It was drafted in perfect legal language. It established a joint agricultural and financial venture between Abigail Winchester and Wyatt Sterling. Wyatt would contribute his legal expertise, his federal pension, and his labor. Abby would contribute her agricultural expertise, the land yield, and her operational command. Profits were split evenly. Liabilities were shared. And at the very bottom, there was a handwritten clause. This agreement may be dissolved by either party at any time without penalty or loss of original assets. It remains valid only as long as both parties freely choose to uphold it. Abby read the clause twice. She looked up at Wyatt. You know what a marriage license does in this territory, Wyatt? Abby said slowly. I do, Wyatt said. The law says if we marry, you cease to exist as a legal entity. Your name comes off the deed. My name goes on. Your money becomes my money. Your children become my dependents. It makes a woman invisible, Abby said, her voice turning hard. I fought too long and bled too much to ever let a piece of paper make me invisible again. Wyatt nodded. He leaned forward. That is exactly why this is not a marriage license, Wyatt stated. He looked at Abby, then he looked at Caleb and Sarah. He wanted them to hear this. He wanted the boy to know how a man was supposed to act. He wanted the girl to know what she deserved. Listen to me, Wyatt said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. True romance isn't about ownership. It isn't about a man claiming a woman to protect her. He tapped the partnership agreement on the table. True romance is built on absolute equality, Wyatt declared, making sure the educational value of his words was unmistakable. It is built on mutual respect, and most importantly, it is built on the freedom to choose each other daily. If the law says I have to own you in order to love you, then the law doesn't know a damn thing about love. Abby stared at him. The hardness in her eyes completely melted away. Wyatt kept speaking, his voice steady and true. A healthy relationship requires two whole people. I don't want to stand in front of you and shield you from the wind. You've already proven you can handle the wind. I want to stand beside you. Abby looked down at the paper. She ran her calloused thumb over the ink. A partnership, Abby said softly. A partnership, Wyatt confirmed. Nobody stands in front. Nobody stands behind. We wake up every single morning, and we choose this. Not because a territorial law forces us to, not because a piece of paper traps us, but because we want to. Abby looked up. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face. It was the first time Wyatt had seen her truly, freely smile. It changed her whole face. It made her look 10 years younger. You're a strange kind of cowboy, Wyatt Sterling, Abby said. I'm a fast learner, Wyatt replied. Abby stood up. She walked over to the shelf. She grabbed her steel pen and the bottle of black ink. She walked back to the table. She dipped the pen. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. Bold, clear, unapologetic. She handed the pen to Wyatt. He signed his name right next to hers. The letters were the exact same size. Abby looked at Caleb. Come here, Caleb, Sarah. I need witnesses. Caleb stepped forward. He took the pen. He signed his name with pride. Sarah took the pen next, her small hand carefully writing her name beneath her brother's. It was done. It was not a church wedding. There were no flowers. There was no veil. There was just a kitchen, a ticking clock, the smell of pine smoke, and two people who had fought through the mud, the lies, and the fire to find something real. Wyatt stood up. He looked at Abby. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He offered his hand. Abby took it. Her rough, calloused fingers intertwined with his scarred ones. Their grip was strong, equal. "What do we do now, partner?" Wyatt asked, a quiet warmth in his voice. Abby looked out the frost-covered window. She looked at the snow, the barn, and the fences she had built with her own 2 hands. "The snow is deep," Abby said. "We better go check the cattle." Wyatt smiled. "Yes, ma'am." They walked out the door together, side by side, into the cold, into the work, into the life they had chosen to build on their own terms every single day. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you stories of the Wild West, cowboys, love, motherhood, human compassion, and the bonds that define us. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with others, and subscribe to support more meaningful stories like this. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Our channel shares stories of the Western world: cowboys, love, motherhood, kindness, and the deep bonds between people. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share it with others, and subscribe to support more meaningful content. As the dust settles over Oak Creek and the wind carries the last echoes of a hard-fought battle, what remains is not just a victory of land, but a victory of truth. Abby Winchester did not simply reclaim a farm. She reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her rightful place in a world that tried to erase her. Her story reminds us that the harshest battles are not always fought with guns or fists, but with persistence, clarity, and the courage to stand firm when everything around you demands that you bend. The meaning behind this story runs deeper than the plains she fought to protect. It teaches us that truth has weight. Even when ignored, even when buried under lies, it does not disappear. It waits. And when someone is brave enough to carry it forward, it can reshape an entire system. Abby's ledger was more than ink on paper. It was a quiet rebellion, a testament that every drop of sweat, every sleepless night, every sacrifice matters, even when no one is watching. In a world that often overlooks invisible labor, especially from those pushed to the margins, her story calls us to recognize, respect, and honor the unseen efforts that hold everything together. There is also a lesson in Wyatt Sterling's journey, a reminder that being part of a flawed system does not make you powerless. It gives you a choice. You can follow orders and preserve your comfort, or you can step beyond fear and stand for what is right. True integrity is not about never being wrong. It is about having the courage to change when you realize you are. Wyatt chose humanity over authority, truth over convenience, and in doing so, he became more than a man of the law. He became a man of justice. But perhaps the most powerful lesson lies in what came after the victory. Abby did not stop at reclaiming her land. She turned her struggle into strength for others. She understood that real change is not measured by a single win, but by how many lives are lifted because of it. By teaching other women to read, to count, to understand the very tools once used against them, she planted something far greater than crops. She planted independence, confidence, and a future where silence would no longer be the norm. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves us with the understanding that dignity is not given. It is claimed. That justice is not automatic. It must be fought for. And that compassion is not passive. It requires action. It asks us to look around in our own lives and question where we may be turning a blind eye, where we might have the power to stand up, and where we can choose courage over comfort. Because in the end, the Wild West was never just about cowboys and outlaws. It was about people, flawed, resilient, and capable of extraordinary change. And just like Abby Winchester, each of us holds the power to write our own ledger, to leave behind a truth so strong that no system, no lie, and no silence can ever erase it.